We all have seen the dramatic drone footage that showed how Ukraine took out part of Russia's strategic nuclear strike force. I mean, you have to let this sink in. The day before the scheduled peace talks. So picture this. Istanbul, just 2 days ago. Kirgan Palace, marble halls, silk curtains, diplomats walking past chandeliers like they're about to sign the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. A historic moment. The world is watching. Russia and Ukraine sitting down across each other, eye to eye. Peace deal. Maybe. Ceasefire. Hopefully. Some kind of breakthrough. Finally. Right? Wrong. It all collapsed before it started. No handshakes, no joint statements, no next round, just silence. Now ask yourself, does this sound like diplomacy failing? Or does it sound like diplomacy being set up to fail? Because what happened in Istanbul wasn't a failed negotiation. It was sabotage, a performance, a rigged game from the start. And the most dangerous part? Almost nobody's asking who the hell rigged it. Now, before I proceed, let me just say that I've published an expose on Substack that goes way deeper than I can go in this video. If you really want to understand what's going on here, I invite you to read it. The link's in the description. Now, if you live in the West, here's the version you have been fed. Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked. Ukraine is defending democracy. The West is just helping out. The war is tragic, but necessary. Simple, right? That's the point. Simplicity sells, especially when you're selling bombs, drones, and a forever war. But let's hit pause, because the truth is way messier and way more damning. Because this war didn't drop out of the sky in February 2022. It didn't start with tanks rolling into Donbas. And it sure as hell didn't start with Putin going mad. To get to Istanbul 2025, we've got to rewind decades. I rewind, but I make it short. Back in 1990, US Secretary of State James Baker stood in a room with Soviet officials and said the words, "Not 1 inch eastwards." The deal? If the Soviets let Germany reunify, NATO would stay put, no expansion. But what happened next? NATO gobbled up 15 countries, and I think I don't even count Finland and Sweden. Poland, Romania, the Baltics, and even countries that used to be Soviet republics. And then Ukraine. In 2008, US ambassador to Russia, a guy named William Burns, former CIA director under Biden, sent a famous cable titled "Niet means Niet." It was blunt. He warned, trying to pull Ukraine into NATO could split the country in two. It could trigger a civil war. It could force Russia to intervene militarily. Sounds familiar? That wasn't a Russian threat. It was a Western prediction coming from a senior diplomat. And of course we ignored it. Or worse, we acted on it as if we wanted this confrontation to happen. Then of course came 2014, the Maidan coup. A democratically elected but Russian-leaning government ousted. The US, they cheered it on. Victoria Nuland and John McCain handed out cookies on site. A new pro-Western regime came in and the country split. Eastern Ukraine didn't want NATO, didn't want EU integration. They wanted autonomy. And they got bullets. If you watch my channel, you already know that this really was a coup. And it was instigated, orchestrated, financed and directed by the US. Remember Victoria's infamous leaked phone call where she said literally,
"Fuck the EU."
Pardon my French. What followed? A war in the Donbas that killed over 14,000 Russians before Russia's invasion to Ukraine. But you won't hear that number on CNN, because it doesn't fit the story. Russia is evil, Ukraine is the victim, and NATO, of course, is the savior. You want another chilling example? The Odessa massacre, May 2014, when 42 Russian-speaking Ukrainians were burned alive inside the trade union building. No Western outrage, no sanctions, no hashtags. So by the time Putin rolled in 2022, this wasn't a new war, it was a metastasized one. And what was the big lie? That this war was unprovoked. So let me ask you something. If someone kept putting missiles on your doorstep, say in Cuba, toppled your neighbors' governments, say in Mexico and Canada, and funded militias inside those countries, militias who attack you and who kill you, would you call it unprovoked if you finally struck back? Of course not. Now, am I defending everything that Russia did? No. But I am saying this. Calling this an unprovoked war is like calling the Vietnam War a camping accident. It's not just dishonest, it is propaganda in the literal sense. And the thing about propaganda, it doesn't just hide the truth, it replaces it. And that's how we ended up at Istanbul 2025. A peace summit doomed by the very people who claimed to want peace. But to really understand what happened in Istanbul, we have to talk about Minsk. Now, Minsk wasn't just a bar in Belarus. It was supposed to be a peace agreement. Two of them actually brokered in 2014 and 2015. The idea, no surprise, stop the bloodshed in Donbas. Remember, 14,000 killed Russians. Pull back heavy weapons. Let eastern Ukraine have autonomy within Ukrainian borders. Ceasefire, dialogue, decentralization. Pretty reasonable stuff if you ask me. Except nobody ever planned to honor it. How do we know? Well, fast forward to 2022. Angela Merkel, former German Chancellor, drops a political grenade. She tells Die Zeit, a German newspaper, the 2014 Minsk agreements was an attempt to give Ukraine time. Not peace, time. Time for what? Rearm, fortify, westernize. And then, of course, François Hollande, France's ex-president, echoes it. And Poroshenko, the former Ukrainian president, he brags about it on record. We didn't sign Minsk to keep peace. We did it to buy time to build our army. His words. Think about that. Russia signed Minsk in the belief that peace was possible. Meanwhile, the West and Ukraine were treating it like a stalling tactic, a playbook chess move. The result? Total collapse of trust. Can anyone be surprised? When Istanbul rolled around in 2025, Moscow had zero faith in any Western brokered ceasefire. It wasn't paranoia, it was simply pattern recognition. And remember something else from 2022? Also in Istanbul, Ukraine and Russia had actually signed a peace accord. Putin showed the signatures on live TV. But then Boris Johnson, who was British Prime Minister at the time, was sent to Kiev to ensure Zelensky keeps fighting. And by some accounts, a million dead Ukrainians further, he still keeps defending this decision. Now let's add a puzzle piece that most people didn't notice, but which matters. Why were the Russian strategic bombers like sitting ducks, parked in neat rows out in the open? George Bibe, former director of Russian analysis at the CIA and author of The Russian Trap, explains it. See under START, the Strategic Arms Control Treaty that was signed between Russia and the US. Russia and the US have to visibly park their nuclear-capable bombers in open air. Why? So they can be tracked by satellites for verification. It's part of a nuclear arms transparency. Russia wasn't being careless. They were following arms control rules. The US does exactly the same thing. That's part of the deal. And what happened? Ukraine used the transparency, that compliance, as a targeting map. Which brings us to Operation Spider's Web. Operation Spider's Web was the codename for the attack that hit 24 hours before Istanbul. And this wasn't a backwater skirmish, it was a massive, multi-phased drone assault deep into Russian territory. Codenamed Operation Spider's Web, as I already said, it was bold, complex and strategic. And here is how it worked. Over 100 drones, some say 140, launched from mobile truck sheds, hit a number of Russian bases, I believe 4. The targets, Russia's long-range bombers, Tu-95s and Tu-160s. Ukraine claimed they destroyed or damaged 41 aircraft, although verification is a bit tricky, including a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. If true, this isn't a minor attack. This has strategic consequences. And this wasn't about the front lines. It was a deep strike, some as far as 4,000 kilometers inside Russia, on the backbone of the nuclear deterrent. Again, this will have strategic consequences. And Zelensky, he didn't even try to downplay it. He called it absolutely brilliant, boasting he ran the operations from inside Ukraine, just blocks away from an FSB outpost, FSB being Russian intelligence. Now, imagine you are Russia. Follow me for this little thought experiment. You have just had your nuclear bombers taken out by drones. The supposed ceasefire talks are tomorrow. And the guy you're negotiating with is giggling in a press conference. Would you walk into that room calm and cooperative? I don't think so. Was this attack a provocation or a message? Spider's web wasn't just militarily, it was psychological. It was a way of saying, we can hit you anywhere, even if you're following the rules, even when you think peace is coming. And what did Putin do? Unfortunately, exactly what you would expect. Russia launched retaliatory missile barrages just before the Istanbul talks. And these retaliatory strikes, of course, provided the Western media with a tenor they needed. Because they played their hits. Putin bombs Kiev as talks begin. No mentioning of spider's web, no timeline, no cause and effect, just narrative. Now, let's talk motive, let's talk gain. Let's ask the most dangerous question in this game. Cui bono? Who benefits? Because this wasn't just a drone strike. It was a strategic chess move. And somebody thought a failed peace deal was better than a successful one. So, who wanted this to fail? Let's start with Zelensky. By mid-2025, he's in an impossible spot. Domestically, he's virtually boxed in. Hardliners in his cabinet, nationalists in the army, and a public that's been told daily, hourly, that any negotiation is betrayal. And of course, and I will come back to this, he's riding a war economy now. Billions flowing in from the US and the EU. Media glorified him as a Churchill 2.0. So how do you suddenly turn around and tell your people, well folks, we are negotiating with Putin? Well, you don't. Not unless you are ready to be toppled. Worse even, a ceasefire that leaves Russia holding territory is political suicide. Maybe not only political. Unless it comes with big guarantees. NATO membership, US troops, maybe even a Marshall Plan 2.0. Which is to say, peace talks couldn't just stall, they had to die. And spider's web, that was the killer. But to be fair, it's not just Ukraine. Let's talk about the polite imperialists in suits, the Europeans. Scholz, Sunak, and now Macron, Merz, Starmer. They all gave peace lip service. Meanwhile, record arms shipments, long-range missiles, joint exercises on Russia's doorstep. They weren't preparing for peace, I can tell you that. They were preparing for escalation. You really have to understand this. Why? Two reasons. One, defense contractors. BAE Systems, stock is up 58% since 2022. Rheinmetall, Germany, over 300% up. Thales, Leonardo, General Dynamics, all booming. All of them have new factories. And these factories are running 24/7, and they do so to supply Ukraine and Eastern Europe with artillery, drones, armored vehicles. These aren't emergency contracts, they are structural. Peace would kill that pipeline. Two, and more importantly, geopolitics. They're virtually reshaping Europe. They're trying to maintain US hegemony. They're rebuilding NATO's relevance, pushing the EU into militarization, locking in US security dominance for decades. That's what they want. US continued hegemony. And then, of course, there is the energy card, which you can never see apart from geopolitics. Since the Americans blew up Nord Stream, Russia is out. Instead, US LNG is in, even though with 4 times the price. Big oil wins again. So no, peace was never the plan. Prolonged, controllable war was and is. Now, here's where it gets murky and ugly. Leaked British military files exposed something called Project Alchemy. Sounds mystical, but I assure you, it's not. It was a covert UK initiative to maximize Ukraine's fighting potential, even if it meant catastrophic risks. One document showed British officers greenlighting a river assault in Kherson that turned into a bloodbath. The goal? To boost morale and maintain Western support, not to win strategically. Alchemy wasn't about helping Ukraine to win. It was about keeping Ukraine fighting at all costs. So when Spider's Web happened, deep, strategic, long prepped. Are we really supposed to believe London and Washington were surprised? I don't think so. This was theater, coordinated, backed, and encouraged. You don't hit 40 plus strategic bombers up to 4,000 kilometers deep inside enemy territory with homemade drones and wishful thinking. You need intel, and this is where the Americans come in: satellite tracking, communications jamming, real-time surveillance. In other words, NATO's fingerprints are all over this, and Putin knows it. This is where Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov came out and said, quote, "A handful of European politicians were actively sabotaging peace." Not passively, actively. Diplomats are careful with their words. Encouraging reckless military actions, playing spoiler behind closed doors. And nobody in the West rebutted it. They didn't even mention it, because Lavrov wasn't accusing just Ukraine. He was pointing fingers at London, Berlin, and Washington. Some said these were Trump's peace talks. Let's see how they got torpedoed. Trump, for all his flaws, has done one thing no one else had done. He got both sides on the table. He sent retired General Keith Kellogg. He helped mediate the biggest prisoners of war swap of the war. He was ready to trade security guarantees for ceasefire framework. But once Istanbul fell apart, he was done. And here's what's rarely mentioned. Trump had a heated meeting with Zelensky after the talks. Sources say Trump warned his counterpart, make peace or lose US support. But Zelensky refused. He said no to any land concessions, no negotiations without full withdrawal. The meeting ended in tensions, to put it mildly. And just like that, Trump's 24-hour peace plan dead on arrival. Back in DC, his own national security people were quietly undermining him. Leaks, policy reversals, arms deals still flowing. The deep state he always talked about, this time he wasn't wrong. And the final weapon in all of this, it's not drones, it's not tanks, it's narrative. Because none of this works, not the sabotage, not the betrayal, not the escalation, without media obedience. And the Western media, they didn't just fall in line, they became full spectrum PR. And as a behavior analyst, I can tell you a thing or two about that. So when Ukraine launched Operation Spider's Web and took out Russian strategic bombers, the coverage didn't scream provocation, it screamed bravery, daring strike, a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Ukraine shows it can strike anywhere. No mention of the timing, 24 hours before peace talks. No mention that Russia's bombers were legally parked under the START treaty terms. No geopolitical context, just fire and applause. But when Russia retaliated, suddenly it was Putin bombs Kiev during peace efforts. Moscow derails talks with new wave of missile strikes. As if cause and effect had completely reversed. As if nothing had happened just the day before. That's not journalism. That's stenography for power. So what happens when the context vanishes? Well, selective silence. How often did you hear about, let's say, the 14,000 Russians killed in the Donbas before 2022? The Odessa massacre in 2014? The integration of the neo-Nazi Azov battalions into Ukraine's official military. I guess you didn't. Because those facts don't fit the story, they don't fit the mainstream narrative. They complicate the morality play. They challenge the idea that this is just good versus evil, the black and white dichotomy. They remind people that NATO's expansion had consequences, and that the West isn't just a neutral bystander. And when you point it out, as I can testify, you get deplatformed. You get hit with Russian propaganda, whataboutism, apologist, and my favorite one, Putin Versteher, as if understanding Putin would be a bad thing. As Noam Chomsky put it, Americans aren't censored from hearing Russian views. They're just never allowed to know what Russia is actually saying. Silence is cleaner than suppression, and that's how you manufacture consent. I've put a link to my interview with him in the description. And this is the trap the West fell into, or sleepwalked into, and willingly so. The war isn't about Ukraine winning, it's about Russia losing. That's the real endgame. Ukraine is the stage, NATO is the playwright, Russia is the villain, and peace ruins the show. Because if peace is possible, then all the suffering, the million dead Ukrainians, all the escalation, all the proxy warfare becomes unnecessary. And unnecessary wars are crimes. So peace must be portrayed as a trick, a Russian ruse, a Trojan horse. And that's exactly what the media did. By the time the talks failed in Istanbul, most Westerners were already conditioned to believe they couldn't have succeeded anyway. Which is the final irony. You can't sabotage peace if the public doesn't believe peace was ever possible. So let's briefly rewind what we have unpacked. A high-profile peace summit collapsed before lunch. A strategic drone strike on Russia's nuclear assets right before the negotiations. A Western media that erased the provocation and painted Russia as the spoiler. Western leaders and military lobbies with everything to lose if peace broke out. A Ukrainian government that couldn't survive compromise, virtually. A US president boxed out of his own diplomacy by his own institutions. And a treaty system exploited by one side and used against the other. And through it all, the same headlines, the same story, the same lie. Jacques Beau, former Swiss intel officer and NATO advisor, nailed it. The West's goal is not Ukraine's victory, it's Russia's defeat. And if that means sacrificing Ukraine to the grinder, so be it. And we are seeing it already playing out. And that's why the Istanbul peace talks had to fail. Not by accident, but by design. Because by implication, to admit peace was possible, it is to admit that war was chosen, not by Moscow alone, but by London, Berlin and Washington, and of course by Kiev too. The West didn't just watch peace collapse, it shoved it off the balcony. So let's land this where it belongs, not in outrage, but in recognition. Recognition that what we have witnessed in Istanbul wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Carefully timed, elegantly styled, with a conclusion known in advance. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Peace is not just an elusive dream in that system. It's the enemy of the system. This is something you really have to understand. Peace threatens the arms economies. Peace threatens political careers built on toughness, not tact. Peace threatens the media spectacle that feeds on bombs, not ballots. So what do? They erase any nuance. They flatten history. They strip context from conflict until only one story is left, and that's the story they wrote in advance. A story where Russia acts alone, where NATO's expansion never happened, where Minsk never mattered, where 14,000 dead Russians never died in the Donbas, where Operation Spider's Web never provoked anything, where Putin just wakes up one day and bombs Kiev for sport. They feed to this cartoon because the truth is far too dangerous. Because the truth is this: the Istanbul peace process was not credible. The parties weren't really talking. Trump's team had no leverage. The deal wasn't really possible. And it was shattered not by accident, but by design. As Chomsky said, if a war is truly unprovoked, you don't need to keep insisting it was. This war needed provocation. It needed sabotage. It really needed you, the public, to never hear the full story. Because if you knew that peace was on the table and they swept it off out of greed, pride and power lust, then all the death that followed becomes unforgivable. So let's forgive nothing. Let's forget nothing. Let's name this moment for what it was. Peace, not failed, but murdered. And if we want it back, we start by indicting the story that killed it. If you made it that far, congratulations, you are ahead of the pack. If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. It really makes a difference. And as mentioned before, if you want to get an even deeper analysis, make sure to follow me on Substack. In my Substack newsletters, I dig even deeper. I break down tricky ideas, show you practical analytical techniques, and explain how you can use them in your life. It's free, the link's right below, and I would love for you to join the conversation. Let me know how it's changing the way you look at the world and its people. As always, thanks for your support and see you next time. And remember, always look beyond the headlines.